Parents of Reddit. What's the creepiest thing you've ever heard from your child? Story 1. My daughter once asked, "Is today the day the glass breaks?" Confused. I said no. 10 minutes later, the living room window shattered from a stray cricket ball. Story 2. Not my child, but am much older than my sister. One day when she was about 4 or 5 years old, we were playing in her room. She stopped mid-sentence and stared out her window. She looked scared for a second and then just annoyed. I don't see anything weird, so I asked her what was wrong, and we have the following conversation. The tall man is back. "Oh, do you want to go somewhere else?" "No, let's just play." "Is he scary?" Annoyed sigh. "No, he just looks at me." "He just looks?" "Yeah, and sometimes he goes down the hall like a hoverboard." "Oh, well, okay. How about we go play in the living room?" Story 3. My son, who was around 7 at the time and my only child, would play in his room and have these vivid conversations. I just brushed it off as imaginary play. But these convos were about our family. One day, out of curiosity, I asked who he was talking to, and he told me his sister that was in heaven came to play with him and described what she looked like. I had just had a miscarriage a few months prior to this happening, and he described a baby girl that would have looked like me. Then one day he randomly came to me and said, "Mommy, my sister isn't coming back anymore. She says I have new sister coming to play with me." Creeped me out. But I did find out a week or two later I was pregnant, and I ended up having a girl. Edited for clarity. Story 4. My dad passed after a long, painful struggle with cancer. When my son was around 18 months old, I was still grieving a few months later when my son woke from a nap, and I went to his room to get him. When I opened the door, he pointed behind me and said, "Who's that man?" We were alone in the house, but I looked behind me anyway, to see nothing. I said, "What does he look like?" My son answered, "He looks like the sun." A few days later, we were playing on his toy telephone, having pretend conversations. My son passed me the phone and said, "It's Papa." My eyes welled up instantly, and I asked him, "What does he say?" My son paused like he was listening and said, "I love you." Another pause. "I miss you." I'm usually not the type to believe the supernatural, but it really made me believe that he came to say goodbye to us and let us know he was okay. Story 5. I was babysitting my cousin, and her bedroom door swung wider open of its own accord. I said, "Well, that was creepy," and slammed the door shut. She said, "Hey, why'd you slam the door on Grandma?" Our same grandma who died 3 months before she was born. Story 6. One of my kids came wandering out his bedroom at like 1 a.m. and told me he couldn't sleep because the shadows are angry. Like, thanks, kid. Now that's a thing I'm gonna think about forever. Story 7. When my daughter was born, my 2-year-old son, sweetest guy ever, was holding her, looks at me all serious and goes, "We don't strangle our baby sister." Story 8. Is mommy home? I saw her walk by the door. My wife was working nights, and my daughter said she saw her walk by the bedroom door way earlier than she would have been home. I told her maybe it was a fly or something she saw move out of the corner of her eye, but then she said no, it was this color, and pointed at her arm. The creepy thing is that I had been seeing things out of the corner of my eye a few times that night, but didn't say anything about it. Story 9. When my older daughter was 3, she colored all of her dolls to look like they had been beaten up or cut, and then covered all their eyes with bandages. When I asked her why she did it, she said all her dolls were dead and wanted me to see what he did. The only people watching her at that point were us or my parents, and neither of us have that kind of a household, so I don't know where the it came from. Story 10. Not a parent, but my nephew is at the stage where everyone who looks remotely like my brother is Dada. My brother is tall with light brown hair, so there are a lot of guys out there who look like him to the lil guy. It always cracks my SIL and I up when we go to the store and he's pointing around at everyone saying Dada. A few weeks ago, I was watching him for a few hours while his parents were at an event, and I was getting him settled in his crib, tucked into his sleep sack. Just as I straightened up, his eyeline went from my face to somewhere above my shoulder, like he was looking at someone tall standing behind me, and he smiled and went, "Dada." I whipped around so fast, and there was no one there, but it scared the absolute out of me, LMAO. Story 11. I was reading to my niece in her bed once. She was probably around 3, totally normal. And then she suddenly looked into the corner of the room and said, "Shh, please stop screaming. I can't hear the story." Then back to normal. We finished the book in the living room. Story 12. My 3-year-old won't stop saying there's a ghost in the bathroom, specifically in the bathtub. He loves taking baths, so I don't think he's just afraid of the room tub, but I can't figure out what he's talking about. When he talks about ghosts, he's usually referring to the white sheet over the head, Halloween type of ghost. Like, he puts a blanket over his head and says, "Mommy, I'm spooky ghost." I've held him up and told him to point to the ghost, but he just points to a corner of the tub with nothing in it. And when I get close to the wall, he says, "Right there," and says he's touching the ghost, but his hand is just suspended in the air, not touching anything. Story 13. When my son was 2, he suddenly had an imaginary friend named Boy. According to him, Boy came home with us from behind the shed at my friend's house. Boy used to play with him. He talked to Boy. We had to set a seat at the table and a spot in the car for Boy. Occasionally, I would ask him where Boy was, and he would say things like, "Oh, he's walking right behind you." Boy eventually went away after more than a year of being around, but my son is 7 now, and if I ask him about boy, he says he doesn't want to talk about it. Story 14. I was putting my daughter to bed when she was around 3 and she said, "Mummy, why did you take so long to be ready for me? I'm glad I picked you to be my mummy, but you made me wait so long." My other daughter, when she was 2, said something like, "I remember when I was your mummy and other daughter was your brother. That was a long time ago," and has on more than one occasion said, "Mummy, when will I see my other mummy again? Creepy little weirdos." Story 15. My daughter was 3, looked up from playing and at an empty wall, waved, and called, "Bye." I got a message about an hour later that my aunt had passed away that afternoon. She was the closest I had to a grandma, but she never met my kids because we lived in different countries. I'm not religious, but still feel like she came to check in on us before going. Story 16. My then 3-yo was having problems sleeping and said it was because the black flyer thing had been visiting him at night. When asked what it looked like, he basically described a ring wraith type creature that flew around his room in the dark, and he ended the description with, "He doesn't have eyes, but he can still see you." We let him sleep with his lamp on after that. Story 17. She was barely 2, and as clear as day she said, as we watched a butterfly float by, "Next time I want to come back as that." My jaw dropped. We aren't religious or spiritual, or at least we weren't. I've been questioning everything since. Story 18. We have no one in our family who has this name or anything close. No friends. ECT. Our 2-yo kept seeing ya 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 in my room, ya ya there. And the worst, ya ya no like that. Story 19. Not my child cause I was the child. I was frequently seeing things as a child. My parents told me once when I was 5 years old, I was sitting on the rug with my Barbies while they watched TV. They said my head snapped up and my eyes went a bit distant before I said, "Someone died in here," while I looked past them. Apparently, I snapped right out of it after a few seconds and went right back to playing. Basically, I was the kid you see in horror movies, LOL. Story 20. Not my child, but I remember hanging out with a friend of mine when his little brother walked up to him and asked, "Do you remember when I wear big and you wear little?" Not exactly creepy, per se, but it was strange. Story 21. Other parent. Okay, but why did you scratch Quinn? Hippie toddler. He didn't have wings to rip off context. We had just found out my toddler, both youngest and tallest in his pre-K class, was getting bullied. He scratches the kid. We were expecting that was the reason. Nope. Our boy, who literally got thrown off a slide and would not snitch, lost his when he saw bully go after a butterfly. Watch the sweet ones. They feel big things too, and less practice holding back when they final snap-o. Oh. Story 22. Middle of the night, my son comes into my room, stands in the doorway, and says, "Are we still playing the game?" Then turns and walks away. I did not sleep the rest of the night. Story 23. Last year daughter was 6. I was in the bathroom, she was in her bedroom, and I had a sensation of someone walking past the bathroom door, like a shadow passing. Daughter came out her room and said, "Who was that?" I asked what she meant, and she said, "Who was the pretend person who just walked past?" I asked how it was a pretend person, and she said they were all gray, like a shadow but a person. I keep telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. Story 24. When my daughter was 5, she told me a man woke her up and said she had to choose whether to go up to the sky or down to the ground. We are not religious. I told her she could choose to just stay with me instead. Thankfully, he has not presented her with any other ultimatums. Story 25. When my daughter was around 3 years old, my wife and I were hanging out in our room. She pointed at our closet and said, "An angel." We hadn't talked about angels with her or taken her to church, so we weren't sure where she had heard that. I walked her to the closet and she kept pointing to the same spot saying, "There was an angel." We decided to let it go because there was no one in the closet, and if there was an angel, that wouldn't be such a bad thing, right? Although, that closet is about 5 feet from my side of the bed, and I would wake up in the middle of the night staring into this dark closet thinking, even if there was an angel, why would it just be chilling in the closet staring at us? I didn't sleep great. A week later, my daughter and I were in the bedroom, and I asked her if the angel was still there. She said, "Yes, it's right there," and pointed at the same spot in the closet. We didn't talk to her about it for another few weeks because we figured if we didn't talk about it, it wouldn't become a big thing. A few weeks later, I couldn't help myself and I carried her into the closet. It's a walk-in. I asked her, "Is the angel still in here?" Her, "Yes, right here." Me, "What is their name?" Her, "I don't know." Me, "What color are their eyes?" Her, "Orange." Me, "What are they wearing?" Her, "They are all orange with a tail, like Daniel Tiger." My blood ran cold and chills ran down my back. That's no angel. I immediately took her out of the room. I researched online how to bless a room, and I prayed in the closet and told whatever it was welcome in our home. We didn't talk about it for a couple months, and one day I asked her about the angel, and she had no idea what I was talking about. So, whether it was something she made up or a demon in my closet, either way it was gone. We've since moved away and have never had any similar issues. Story 26. Not as creepy as some I've heard, but when our son was around 5, we got a Roomba, and he named him Blinky. One day, he became very scared of the Roomba, and when I tried to talk to him about it, He told me Blinky sees you. Blinky is always watching. Story 27. My daughter did something that kind of wigged me out when she was a toddler. We were visiting my parents. She looked right at a rocking chair, waved, said, "Hi, Huey," and went back to playing. That was my godfather Hugh's rocking chair. He had been dead for over a decade at that point. Story 28. I was having severe, like go to the hospital level abdominal pain and nausea during a time I was getting worked up for known gallbladder issues, wondering if I had an obstruction again. It felt just like it did before. I was scared and in agony and dreading moving, even to call for help. Kiddo was 5, had come into my bed without my knowing before I was woken by pain. Out of nowhere, from sound asleep, he goes, "Mommy, you need to stand up now." So I did. It hurt so bad. He was already asleep again. I stood for a minute, and as I did, the pain that was cutting through my core to my spine slowly disappeared. A few minutes later, the nausea went away. I don't know what it was. I didn't or anything simple to explain it like gas pain. Just gone. I didn't even know he was there till he spoke. My woo-woo brain thinks one of my known stones was stuck, and he helped me clear it somehow. Or maybe it was just a spasms. I'll never know, haha. Story 29. Not my child, but me. When I was little, I used to talk about my grandfather, my mother's father who passed before I was born, coming to visit me. I would talk about him, tell stories about him, things that were correct, but she swears I didn't hear from someone else. I would also tell stories from her childhood as if it had happened to me. Again, stories she's sure I had never heard before. I grew out of it and don't remember any of it, but I did have a very strange incident later in life, maybe 18, 19 years old. My mom and I were out together and a man walked by smoking a pipe. As soon as I smelled it, I was overwhelmed with this feeling of intense nostalgia. I really can't even describe it. The emotions were so intense it made me tear up. Next thing I know, my mom is walking up to him and asking him if he was smoking X brand, can't remember what exactly. And when he said, "Yeah, how did you know?" She said it was the only kind my father smoked. I'd know it anywhere. As soon as she said it, everything just felt right. Like I knew down to my bones that was correct, but I know for a fact I've never smelled it before. No one I've ever known smoked a pipe, and he was gone long enough it's not like I would have picked up the smell in my grandmother's house. Weirdest thing I've ever experienced, and I genuinely have no explanation for it. Story 30. When my daughter was a toddler, she would often cry and point to the dark corner in the hallway at night. Then we moved away from that place when she was almost 4 years old. Years later, we drove by that place and I asked her if she remembers anything about it. She said she remembers a tall, dark man standing in the corner in the hallway. Story 31. Between maybe 3 to 4 years of age, my daughter had an imaginary friend she called Otro, which we learned much later means other in Spanish. She started using Spanish words from time to time that she said Otro taught her. Story 32. Not my kids, but I work with kids in creche. 5 years ago, a 3YO was playing and speaking alone in a ball pool we have. I asked her who she was talking to and say, "It's Robert. He is just here." There was no kids called Robert, and she was looking in empty space. Okay, it can be pretty scary, but I know kids have imaginary friends, so it didn't scare me. But 3 years later, another kid was playing in the same ball pool and speaking with Robert too. I still don't know how it's possible, and I think I don't want to know, haha. Story 33. We stayed in an old country house, and for the entire time, one of my children kept saying that she lived near here with her first family. For the entire week, she referred to me as her second mum. It was really weird. Never mentioned her first family again after we left. Story 34. When my eldest was still in diapers, we lived in a house in which one room in particular creeped me out. One morning, I was in that room's closet, sorting out fresh laundry and hanging some clothes. My daughter toddled into the room, and as she walked closer, I knew she needed a diaper change. So, I grabbed a little portable mat and diaper supplies from that same closet, and I laid it on the floor, right outside of the closet. She knew the drill. She laid down on the mat, and I started the diaper change. With my back to the closet, on my knees, my body half in half out of the closet, my daughter starts telling me, "No." I thought I had accidentally pinched her with the diaper tab, so I said, "Oh no, I'm so sorry." She says again, more firmly this time, "No." I'm confused, so I start checking to make sure the diaper isn't too tight. She then yells, "No, no, no." I didn't understand what was happening, so I asked, "No? What's wrong?" She then points and says, "Not you. Him. Be nice to mommy." I realized that she wasn't pointing at me, but rather behind me. The hair on the back of my neck rose instantly. I picked my daughter up like a football, diaper hanging off, and ran. I imagine I looked like the Heisman Trophy. Every instinct told me to get outside into the sunlight. I don't even remember how I got outside. Anyway, that was one that stands out. Story 35. My son, who was 3 at the time, looked to me very seriously and said, "In 127 days, we will all be dead." Didn't happen, but best believe I marked July 10th on my phone calendar with a reminder. Be careful. Story 36. Son 5 was acting very agitated at bedtime. Prayed over him. He said that won't work in a little bit of a strained voice, switched to Hail Marys and a Saint Michael. Out like a light. Edit spelling. Story 37. Not my child, but at the library I work at. I once heard a 3-year-old with tears in his eyes say to his mom, I didn't mean to say that. It was just the bad man talking. Story 38. When my son was about 5, we lived in a house that a finished attic where the kid's bedroom was. I was walking behind him up the stairs because we were going to clean. He stopped dead on the steps and turned around to me and had zero color in his face. I asked, "What's wrong, honey?" And he said, "I don't like the souls." Story 39. My 2-year-old. Mummy? A cannonball? I sorry. He saw the bronze spheres on the ends of the curtain rods in my bedroom. He knows what a cannonball is because of pirates and things. But the repeated, "I sorry," made me think past life war flashbacks or something. Story 40. When my daughter was 2, she once rocked her dolly and sang this, while making direct eye contact with me. "Ring ring a rosy pock full of posy." I guess so. The lady's dead. Story 41. We were a guest choir invited to perform at an old church. My 5-year-old son walked in and started talking about all the people that died in a fire inside. The fire happened 40 years before I was born. Story 42. I fell asleep in our living room in our recliner watching TV with my wife, who was on the couch. I had a vivid dream of waking up in the same place and talking with her about normal stuff. Nothing had changed surrounding-wise. But then I saw this large shadow figure move behind my wife on the couch and head down the hall towards my daughter's room, and I started yelling and my wife ended up shaking me awake. I attributed it to just a bad dream. The next morning, my 6-year-old daughter comes running into our room crying and screaming that she saw a weird shadow moving in her room. I don't believe in ghosts really, but that had me on edge for a long time. Story 43. So we are currently living in my grandparents' old house. Now my grandpa passed before my daughter was born, but she did meet my grandma, who passed just before she was 2. My daughter met her multiple times and called her Gigi. One day, a few weeks ago, we are sitting in the living room and my daughter goes, "Oh, Mommy, Gigi is here." At first, I looked outside because she also calls my mom's Mom Gigi and thought she came over. My daughter says, "No, Mommy." She went upstairs and I asked her who, and she goes, "Your meme," what I called her, and I was like, okay, cool. Story 44. Just 2 days ago, my 3-year-old said that she wants to play in heaven again and stay there forever. Then again, she told me that her big half-sister also told her that she wanted to kill her and me. So maybe that's where she got that from. Story 45. I've got 3 silly ones. At 14 months old, I had her on my back while we were taking a hike in the remote hilled woods near my mom's house. My daughter, who could maybe string together 2 words at the time, started repeatedly saying, "Bear." Luckily, there was no bear. At 18 months, we were taking a walk through our neighborhood and went past the forested edge. My daughter pointed out into the woods and said, "Hiding people. Hiding peeping people." We chuckled nervously. At around 5 years old, we took my daughter out on a night walk in the neighborhood. We do these pretty frequently. She enjoys them. We rounded the bend from our house and were chatting when our daughter started to interrupt us. She pointed into the distant street and said, "Doggies? Doggies?" We looked and couldn't see anything. Just quiet, still darkness. "I see doggies there." "But they are not doggies. And they are running here fast. And they are scary." Okay, no doubt that one scared us and we scooped her up and skedaddled back to the house. Edit, I forgot one more. My daughter and I were sleeping at my parents' old house, which was an interesting place to say the least. In the middle of the night, I hear my 2-year-old start grumbling and then say, "Pretend there's ghost. Pretend there's ghost." More whining and grumbling. Not pretend. Silence for a bit. I get out. Believe it or not, this was one of the most chill incidents at that house, so I just chuckled and went back to sleep. Story 46. During a long, boring road trip with my son 7 at the time to take him to Nana's son Daddy. "Let's play," Simon says. Simon says, "Touch your nose." "Me okay, son." Simon says, "Make a funny face." "Me okay, son." Simon says, "Rip out all your veins." Me, Story 47. Kissing my 2-year-old at the time son goodnight one night, and after saying, "I love you, bud," he looks up at me and says, "I'm going to eat your bones." Story 48. Posted this for a similar question a few hours ago. Happened to a friend a few years back. His daughter was 5 at the time. He wakes up at 3 a.m. to find her in his room staring at him from the corner of the bed. Once he gets past the initial alarm, he put her back to sleep. As he's hugging her, she said, "You smell different when you're scared." Needless to say, he was creeped out. Story 49. When my nephew was 3, his mom was pushing him on a swing. He turned to her and said, "Mommy, when I died, I was in a boat and it turned over. And then it sank in the water and couldn't breathe anymore. I don't want that to happen again." Then just went on his merry way swinging. She got him to retell it to me later that day, and the way he said it was just so serious and dark. Was spooky. He also mentioned once about how he doesn't like his sister that has red eyes and hangs out in the bathroom. He calls all kids he meets brother or sister. It's pretty adorable until he's talking about some creepy red-eyed ghost child. Story 50. My son used to have friends that would hang around. 2 of them he called Jim and the lady. I asked what they looked like and he said they had boo-boos on their heads. The scariest part ever was when he looked under my bed one day and said the lady was under there. That, and one night he was dead asleep and sat up and told me, "Don't look behind you," and lay back down and fell back asleep. Behind me was the window, and my curtain rod had been broken at the time, so I had nothing covering it. Needless to say, I did not turn around LOL. Story 51. My 5-year-old son was terrible at drawing in kindergarten. He positively loathed it. One day, he came home with a very elaborate drawing for his standards. It had a house to the left and 4 stick figures. 2 were smaller than the rest. One of the kids was pointing at the house, and in its speech bubble was a baby's face drawn. When I asked him about it, he said that my husband and I took him and his best friend for a walk when he told us to return because the baby had woken up and it was crying. God knows we were trying for quite some time at that point, but nothing came of it. We had practically given up at that time. Fast forward a year and he was right. He is a very proud and affectionate older brother now. It is wholesome but still gives me the chills how he put it onto paper. Story 52. Less creepy but more depressing. My kids have had multiple lockdowns at their schools over the years, to the point that they're desensitized to them. Nothing like coming home from work and hearing your 8-year-old daughter casually talk about seeing cops with their guns out while her class was in the storage room. Story 53. My aunt got concerned when her 3-4-year-old was growling something like, "In the name of Lucifer, I command you to spread the blood of the innocent." I guess watching little Nicky with him wasn't a great idea. My bad. Story 54. When my daughter was a baby, she often made a sound while sleeping that sounded exactly like the boy in The Grudge. Had a lot of sleepless nights because of her. Story 55. My son was in my bedroom when he was about 3 and was staring towards the wall when he started giggling. He started waving to the wall and I asked him what he was doing, and he told me the man in Mama's room says hello to Mama. We lived alone. I asked him where the man was and he pointed at the spot he was looking at, looking up. He kept giggling and said the man was funny. Years later, it still creeps me out. There were a few other similar incidents over the years, so I tell myself it's just my friend who passed checking in on us from time to time. Story 56. When I was little, I had this picture book with a different bug for every letter of the alphabet. One day, and I don't remember this at all, I told my mom I was scared of my bug book and didn't want to read it anymore because I saw a scorpion. She told me I was being silly or whatever. Then I go to school, and she finds a dead scorpion under my bed. Story 57. We were cuddling our 8-month-old on the couch getting ready for bed. He was a great sleeper, loved his nursery, and never had a problem going to sleep. I said, "Let's go to bed." And he pointed down the hallway, froze up like an exorcist baby, and started babbling, "No, no, no." Literally frozen flat as an ironing board. My husband and I were spinning out. His eyes looked terrified. I turned on the hallway light, and he was still stiff and looked terrified. I carried him into the kitchen, and he snapped out of it. It was weird because the hairs on my arms stood up, and I felt scared. Uneasy. He slept in the fold-out cot in our room that night. Next night went to bed as normal. Kids are strange. Story 58. We rented a house from my father-in-law for a couple of months when my son, an only child at that point, was about 3 and we were waiting for a house purchase to go through. One night we'd gone to bed, and shortly after we heard him talking, so I got up to get him back into bed. He was standing at his door where there was an infant gate fitted to prevent him getting out. I asked him why he was out of bed. He pointed behind me and said, "I'm talking to the little girl." We later found out a young girl had died in the house about 50 years before. Interestingly, our cat would also refuse to go into 2 rooms in that house. My in-laws live there now and their dog won't go into the same rooms. Story 59. Maybe not creepy, but gave me chills. This was the first of several crazy things he said, but it seems to have calmed down now. My son was 2 when I got pregnant with 2. We did tell him I was pregnant, but he honestly didn't seem like he understood or cared. We lost that baby right at 10-11 weeks. It was a traumatic experience that lasted about a month. So in the hustle and bustle, I genuinely DK if we told him the baby wasn't there anymore. Anyway, fast forward about 18 months, and I'm heavily pregnant with our next baby. He would have been almost 4. We're in the care coming home from daycare and I'm just taking a moment to talk to him about the baby coming soon, etc. And he pipes up, "Mom, is this baby going to come home and live with us?" And I said, "Well, that's the plan, bud." And he goes, "Well, because my brother didn't. He came and told me that he couldn't stay with us and he was going to go live in the clouds and that he'd watch over me." I was floored because we are not a religious family, to the point where I watch what I say regarding anything like that. There is no way any of us would have said anything about the baby passing away and going to live in the clouds. Additionally, and take this woo-woo with a grain of salt, but there is some comfort points that go around communities around pregnancy loss that say stuff like the baby's soul will come back in a future pregnancy, which can be comforting. I never really felt like that applied to me and these babies, though. It just didn't resonate. And so to hear that my son thought the first one was a boy, which I did too, but never confirmed, and then my next kiddo is a girl, I just was a little taken aback by that. He also had key thoughts and experiences on both of my grandmothers passing away, which also was wild to me, ESP, because he was more articulate about those. Kids are weird, man. Story 60. I work with kids and I found out I was pregnant. I was very early and hadn't told anyone. I was playing with a small group of children and one stopped and looks at me. "You have a baby in your tummy." she said. I was a little shocked but played it down. It replied, do I? What makes you think that? And she looked me dead in the eye and whispered, I can hear their voice. Story 61. Son was a toddler when my dad died. The day after the funeral, my son refuses to sleep in his grandma's room and tells us grandpa is there anyway to keep grandma company. Story 62. One time I was putting her to bed. She looks and points to an empty ceiling corner and says, who is that? And I wanted to run out of there so fast but had to stay chill. Story 63. Obligatory. Not a parent, but I worked at a summer camp and I was playing Dead Long Story and a girl came up to me and said, you're not dead. If you were dead, you'd be twitching. Terrifying to hear from a 7-year-old. Story 64. My son was about 4 or 5 when, apropos of nothing, said, I was a cosmonaut before I was born. I was half listening and said, oh, you were an astronaut? No, I said a cosmonaut. He was extremely insistent. He'd been on a bit of a space kick, so I figured one of his books brought up the term. I looked, and none of them mentioned the term cosmonaut. So, yeah, for a hot minute, it sounded like he was casually mentioning a past life. Even weirder, he and his younger sister both claim that they knew each other and were friends that played together before they were born. Story 65. I don't personally find this creepy, but other people have. When my middlest kiddo was about 3, we were watching YouTube videos for the older kids' science homework. A video of a young woman in a Faraday cage played, and Middles points to the TV and says, that was me. I was a big girl before and the electricity got in my hands. Then I was a baby again. Story 66. When she was 5, a friend of mine told her mother when she was never coming back to this place, and this will be my last time here. Her mother was taken aback by this, and there was no context for this kind of comment. My friend grew up to be a devout Buddhist, and her greatest desire is to not come back to this place. Story 67. When I was about 14, my dad was a bit drunk, and he started talking about my grandfather, his father, whom passed away well before I was born. It was the usual he would have loved you, etc., but he said, I know he watches you and makes sure you will always be okay. This always stuck with me as my dad doesn't believe in anything like that. Anyway, flash forward 12 years or so, my first son was around 2 years old. I was working nights, and my wife worked part-time day job on my nights off. This meant that on the first day I was tired and would nap, when or if he did. One time I woke up on the sofa, and he was sat there playing with his toys. I said, oh, sorry, have you been awake long? My son said, a while, but the man was playing with me. Me? What man? Son? The old one who makes sure we are okay, me? No. What man? Who was here? Son laughing. You're silly, it's granddad. Me, granddad isn't here, he's at his house. Son, the other one, the oldest one. It was creepy and yet soothing all at once.